process. And now I am glad to see a number of people joining us from all over the world today, and many people are introducing themselves in the chat. I would encourage you all to do that and continue the discussion actively throughout the event today. And of course, I know that many of you have joined us for previous events online, both for the summit process and PHAP member events in the last couple of months. But if you'll bear with me, I'll just take a couple of minutes here at the start to offer a few brief instructions as to how to engage with the online platform. So first, and very importantly, we do encourage everyone to pose as many questions as you have on your mind throughout the event, during the presentations, and also, of course, in the dedicated questions and answers session at the end. In order to ask your questions, the best way is to use the Ask a Question box, which you should be able to see in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. There you see the arrow pointing to it. This will send the questions to our team here in Geneva. We'll process them and then present them to the speakers during the Q&A. So please do keep those questions coming. Second, some of you may recall from previous events that we do have the capacity with this online platform to present polls, questions to the participants live during the event. So this is another way in which we can get feedback, get input on the substantive issues that are being discussed from everyone in the so-called virtual room. So when you see a poll box appear, like the one presented here in the screenshot on the slide, choose the option there. We'll collect the questions, it'll collect the answers. It will take just a couple of minutes, and then my colleague Marcus here, who's operating the online system, will display the results for everyone. So our speakers and everyone else in the event can take that input as well into the discussions today. I do also want to point out that we have a live Twitter feed, 2 live Twitter feeds, in fact, coming from the event today. So from the PHAP end, I would encourage you, if you're an avid Twitter user, to follow PHAP Forum, that's PHAP Forum, and also to follow WH Summit, which is being populated by our colleagues in the Summit Secretariat in New York, as well as hashtag ReshapeAid. So for those of you who are Twitter users, we will be actively populating that feed. And now, finally, without further ado, I would like to introduce our 3 panelists for today. We're very fortunate to have with us 3 people who have been very much involved, and very much involved in different ways in the summit process for the North and Southeast Asia region. And they will be sharing with us some insights first regarding the structure of the consultations and the outcomes, and then with our second 2 guests, looking more deeply into some of the recommendations on the specific themes as well as cross-cutting issues, so we can really get into a substantive discussion here today. So first we have with us Oliver Lacey-Hall, who's been a guest with us in these PHAP Summit online events before. We're very pleased to have him back. Oliver is currently head of the regional office for Asia and the Pacific with OCHA. He has several decades of experience in humanitarian work, and of course has been very much involved in his role with OCHA in the organization of the summit. So very fortunate to have him here with us to start off the presentations. We'll then be turning to Pansy Tun Thein, who is currently working as an executive director of the Local Resource Center, or LRC, in Yangon, Myanmar. The LRC serves as a coordinating body and promotes strengthening of civil society organizations in the country. So again, very glad to have Pansy's views on the results of the summit consultations, both on the themes and a couple of cross-cutting issues that are particularly relevant to her work. Pansy is also currently serving as a co-chair of the Gender Equality Network, which comprises over 100 civil society organizations working specifically on gender issues. So she will have, I'm sure, some points to share with us on that cross-cutting issue. Then third, we're very pleased to welcome today Takeshi Komino, who is former head of emergencies at CWS Asia Pacific Regional Office in Bangkok and is currently serving as General Secretary of CWS Japan, as well as regional delegate of the Asian Disaster Reduction and Response Network. He is also a member and the chair of the advisory group for humanitarian policy and practice for ACT Alliance, in which CWS is a member. And then finally, important to note that representing the Asian Disaster Reduction and Response Network, Takeshi was also a member of the regional steering group for the World Humanitarian Summit Regional Consultation, which took place, as we all know, just a few weeks ago in Tokyo. So with that, I'd like to offer one more warm welcome to all of our guest speakers and, of course, all of our participants here today. And since we want to leave as much time as possible for the discussion following the presentations, I will turn the floor directly over to Oliver. And I think that we are muting you now, Oliver, and you should be able to take over control of the presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. I lost you for a moment there, but I hear everybody now. Thank you very much indeed. It's great to be back. And we've done a little PowerPoint presentation to help guide the discussion today. So we'll flash the slides up as we go. So if I can go to the first slide, please. Thank you very much indeed. I'll just give a brief outline of the event. One back, please. Thank you. I'll just go to a brief outline of this event. How we're going to handle it. I'll give a quick overview of the process which led up to the consultation. Very brief because we've discussed this before. Because I think what people are really keen on hearing must be the outcome of Tokyo. I mean, the final report is already out. So people will have the opportunity to go through that, but I think the point of today is to really just kind of go through to go through the presentation and explain a little bit about what happened in Tokyo. So we'll look at the outcome of the 4 thematic workshops, which cover the 4 themes, and also 6 sort of cross-cutting discussions that took place, and then of course we'll have a bit of time at the end for questions and answers. But let me go back a little bit and talk very quickly about the preparatory stakeholder consultations that we briefed on in previous webinars, which of course were also conducted through the World Humanitarian Summit website. I mean, some of the conclusions that came out of this preparatory consultation are, I think, predictable but very useful in terms of reinforcing what we need to be thinking about. One, that our focus has to be on people who are affected by disasters and crises, and sometimes it's simply not. We get focused on other things, and we need to renew our focus on people who are affected by these disasters. A strong recognition that it's really local civil society organizations that play a very important role. They're one of a number of actors, but they're really key to getting things right at the local level. Reinforcement of the message that governments, host governments that are affected by disasters needs to be in the driving seat to make particularly disaster response effective. And there was also some interesting discussion around the role, of course, of governments in conflict that we'll cover a little later in the session today. And that really the emerging trend is that international organizations really need to understand their place in this whole humanitarian sector, which is that we should be providing support to local government partners, and we should be facilitating their response rather than trying to do everything ourselves. Next slide, please. Next one. Thank you. Just to clarify, no, back one, sorry. We had nine groups that we looked at across the 16 countries that were included in the North and Southeast Asia consultation. We had 691 respondents, which is, whilst not enormous when you compare it with the population of the region of the 16 countries, it's still a very significant number of responses. And just under half of those responses were from local actors, from CFOs and from communities. And we undertook this sort of 691 responses were undertaken during May and June through a combination of workshops and surveys, and then a very thorough analytical process which was done by a small team working out of the OCHA regional office here in Bangkok. In Tokyo itself, we ended up with a group of about 140 people, the vast majority of them not from international NGOs, UN agencies, but more from national governments from across the region, from civil society organizations, people who've been in the face of disasters and conflicts themselves, both in the region and outside the region. We had an opening plenary session, which was hosted by the Japanese Foreign Minister, the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia, and Undersecretary General from OCHA, Valerie Amos, who urged us all to be very bold and to be far-reaching in the recommendations that came out of the Tokyo consultation. We looked in some detail through the stakeholder consultation results, and Jamila Mahmood, the head of the director of the World Humanitarian Summit Secretariat, gave us an overview of the global process. Now, all of this information is available online at the North and Southeast Asia page of the World Humanitarian Summit. There's a webcast of all of the morning's events, and the stakeholder consultation results are also available on the web for those who are interested to take a look at them, as well as the PowerPoint presentations from those sessions that took place then. So that sort of took up just the morning of the first day. In the afternoon, we looked at the four thematic areas, the four thematic workshops. And I think we need to go forward 2 slides, please. We looked at the four thematic workshops on humanitarian effectiveness and serving the needs of people in conflict. These were looked at on the afternoon of the first day of the consultation, 2-hour session for each of those, going back to back, I mean at the same time, so running concurrently. And then the same on reducing vulnerability and managing risk on the morning of the second day of the consultation in Tokyo. And at the end of those sets of sessions, we sort of saw a number of emerging issues that required a bit more discussion. And so after lunch on the second day, we had 6 sessions all happening at the same time, looking at migration, at inclusive coordination, at gender, human dignity, complexity, and legal frameworks. Those were the 6 emerging cross-cutting themes. Next slide, please. So the way that the process actually worked was that after each set of workshops, there was a kind of plenary presentation back to the plenary on the key outcomes of those workshops, and a question and answer session. There was a plenary presentation of the 6 cross-cutting themes at the end of the session on the second day. We worked hard to make sure that we had something on paper to walk away with at the end. This was not at all an easy process, and I think left a lot of people thinking it could have been done slightly better. I think our sense was that because there were so few people in the room and so many people outside the room who wanted to understand what the key outcomes were as quickly as possible, that we had a duty to put this document out. That was the responsibility of the 3 co-chairs, which were myself from OCHA and colleagues from Indonesia and Japan. So that went out fairly quickly. We had that out, I think, the Monday after the consultation concluded. And then the full report, the final report, which is a fairly meaty document, far meatier than I think we'd intended or had foreseen, but there was so much discussion and it was so rich we thought it was necessary to capture everything. And of course, the chair summary and the detailed final report are both available for everyone to see online. And the next slide, please. So today what we're going to have is actually three sets of presentations. Pansy Tun Thein from Myanmar is going to give a presentation on the two themes, humanitarian effectiveness and reducing vulnerability and managing risk, which will also cover the cross-cutting issues related to gender and to human dignity. Takeshi will discuss the two themes, transformation through innovation and serving the needs of people in conflict. And we'll look at the complexity and legal frameworks cross-cutting issues. And then after they have spoken, I will briefly come back and provide a little bit on the cross-cutting issues of migration and inclusive coordination. So this is the shape of what we're aiming to do in the next hour or so. I hope it's relatively clear, and I hope this was a useful opening. I think I will now either hand the floor back to Angharad or to Pansy, I'm not sure. So that's it from me for now, but I look forward to taking part in the question and answer session at the end. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Oliver. And we're just going to get Pansy's presentation set up here. One moment, please.
Greetings to you all from Myanmar. Participants in the regional consultation had an in-depth debate on the four themes and identified the challenges and opportunities through plenary sessions and group discussions. These four themes include humanitarian effectiveness, reducing vulnerability and reducing risk, serving the needs of people in conflict, and transformation through innovation. These four themes sought to capture the key challenges to humanitarian action and most important cross-cutting elements. None of these themes are in silos and should not be considered in isolation from the others. For the first theme on humanitarian effectiveness, the participants were divided into four subgroups to discuss the roles and responsibilities of major actors, stronger partnerships and coordination, accountability, and human financing. Subgroup 1 on roles and responsibilities of major actors agreed that governments should take full responsibility for leading and coordinating disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. The humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality should be respected. Also discussed that governments should integrate DRR and preparedness, response, and recovery components into national disaster response legal framework and/or policies. Also highlighted that local civil society and community should be central throughout the process of consulting on each legislation and policies. Also important to clarify roles and responsibility of all actors, including development actors, to promote Build Back Better concept in the wake of disasters and fostering the resilience of affected people and communities. This includes community education to prevent and mitigate the impact of disasters. Subgroup 2 on stronger partnership and coordination discussed that current coordination systems should be more inclusive and could be achieved through increased partnership between international and local actors, including local level government, civil society communities, academia, faith-based organizations, community-based organizations, private sector, military, etc., as part of their preparedness effort for coordinated response. Subgroup 3 on accountability agreed that accountability was about more than defining roles and responsibilities. It was also about building trust and credibility. There is a need to strengthen government's capacity also in order to enhance the trust and credibility that their citizens had in them. Also learning from the private sector, recognizing that companies are more accountable to their clients and ensure that clients receive what they wanted. to also include accountability as one of the humanitarian principles in 2016 World Humanitarian Summit, a broad definition of accountability should be developed, and to advocate for inclusion of accountability into national policy and strategies, and to ensure that the affected communities were at the center in this process. Lastly, non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, and private sector organizations should strengthen advocacy for the mainstreaming of accountability to affected population with all stakeholders. Subgroup 4 on humanitarian financing mainly focus on how to bridge the gap between humanitarian and development financing. Currently, funding was not appropriately allocated for disaster management cycle. More resources should be invested in preparedness and DRR activities, as it is more cost-effective than response. Humanitarian financing is needed to reach local actors, including capacity development of local government, the CSOs, and the communities. The group also discussed that increased focus on humanitarian effectiveness was driven, in part, by increasing humanitarian assistance requirements, which includes transparency, reporting, and accountability, which can be strengthened through maximized use of technology on reporting on humanitarian funding, including expenditures. A set of recommendations on humanitarian effectiveness are as follows. Under national and international legal frameworks, learning from lessons learned and best practices, governments should develop legal framework for humanitarian action which are multi-stakeholder, multi-level, multi-dimensional, that are more systematic at integrating DRR, preparedness, response, and recovery. Humanitarian actors, including regional and international organizations, should work together with governments to ensure comprehensive and inclusive coordination, planning, and response frameworks at the national level. International coordination mechanisms, such as the clusters, should be subordinate to national and subnational government-led mechanisms. Donor countries and agencies should respect the way the affected communities seek or accept offers of assistance and adjust their procedures accordingly. In some cases, the assistance received does not match the needs of the affected population. UN and international agencies need to re-examine their roles in the changing humanitarian landscape. Should also recognize the leading roles national and local actors play in humanitarian action. UN and international organizations need to intensify their efforts to ensure that their structures do not reinforce humanitarian and development divide. On reporting, it is recommended that improved reporting is needed by all stakeholders to capture a more accurate picture of humanitarian funding and assistance. This includes donations from private sector, including goods and services provided, resources and remittances received for humanitarian action. On funding and accountability, recommended that adhering to good humanitarian donorship, or GHD, is important, and to also review GHD to ensure open and transparent accountability framework, which is needed to measure donor performance, just as donors require accountability of humanitarian actors. The second theme on reducing vulnerability and managing risks, Subgroup 1 on managing predictable and recurrent shock noted that in order to help countries and communities better manage shocks, it is important to bring disaster preparedness and disaster management into the national curriculum. One way may be to build platform for education that incorporated all the various aspects, people and key actors to ensure full coordination. DRR should be considered as key priority, not as an add-on to existing programs, and integrated into national planning. Implementation and application of DRR policies should be reflected at all levels, especially at the community level. DRR policy needs to be based on holistic research and forecasting, analyze disaster management statistics and data about where capacity is needed to be strengthened. Community risk mapping should also be developed at the local level and not a top-down approach with full participation by local authorities taking the lead and CSOs and affected communities included. Resources should be allocated to strengthen the resilience of communities to withstand and cope with recurrent shocks. The group also agreed that investing in research is critical for making stronger business case for preparedness and risk reduction, especially considering the difficulty humanitarian organizations are facing in securing preparedness funding. Again, there is a need to learn from private sector and how its resources, including innovative financing, could be applied to finance preparedness and risk reduction. Community resilience was critical to reducing the humanitarian needs of the most at-risk population, particularly migrants, refugees, and internally displaced persons. Key to building community resilience could include development of physical structure, promotion of sustainable livelihoods and employment, capacity building of community people and staff responsible for ensuring preparedness in order to create an enabling environment. That includes improved interdepartmental communication and coordination, organizing simulation exercises and drills, and inclusion of local authorities and CSOs in planning processes. Subgroup 2 on managing future uncertainties and unprecedented shocks agreed that there had been a number of unprecedented shocks in the region, including mega disasters, financial and economic crisis, nuclear emergencies, environmental threats, conflicts, civil unrest, and pandemics, which have been the major implications for economic and social stability. Governments in the region should generate joint risk analysis with key actors, including CBOs and academia. And here it is important to highlight that Southeast Asia is #1 disaster-prone region. Therefore, governments are encouraged to identify key regional players and explore systematic information exchange and promote shared responsibility and ownership. And new financial models need to be explored for increased humanitarian funding. Lastly, importance of early warning system to be in place is emphasized, and the system should be well implemented and understood by community members, especially those who are more vulnerable, such as the children, youth, women, elderly, persons with disability, and marginalized communities. Recommendations on reducing vulnerability and managing risk stated that all stakeholders should support the establishment of various intergovernmental processes taking place from now and the WHS process. All stakeholders must ensure that specific and measurable indicators are included in the post-2015 DRRN development processes, with emphasis on reducing the need for humanitarian response and assistance resulting from natural disasters. All stakeholders should ensure the compilation of stronger evidence on future risks and economic impact of these risks in order to build a better case for more investment and prioritization of DRR, including preparedness and early warning at national, regional, and international levels. Also important to ensure joint risk analysis, planning and financing and advocacy by humanitarian development and on climate change adaptation actors to break down the artificial silos created and to ensure greater alignment of approaches and action on DRR, including preparedness and early warning. Develop stronger collaboration and partnership, including with the private sector and all stakeholders, to better prepare for and respond for disaster. As for cross-cutting issues, 6 topics were identified and discussed at the regional consultation. I would like to cover 2 topics: gender and human dignity. On gender, the group agreed on the importance of national and local governments advocating for women and making it compulsory to ensure women's participation at all levels, both in response planning and implementation. Governments were encouraged to address the cultural aspects inherent to each region to overcome potential barriers and bottlenecks. Participants agreed that national and local governments need to address women's rights and participation in the education system in order to address cultural barriers, and a more holistic approach is needed to address structural barriers, including social, cultural, economic, and political barriers. Some of the approaches suggested to address these barriers include capacity building of women and ensuring that they have access to resources and services. Important to also recognize that humanitarian assistance should reach the women directly, not only through men. Lastly, group concluded that despite the presence of international instruments for gender mainstreaming, there was still room for improvement for many governments in the region to promote gender equality and increasing women's participation in DRR response, and to also seriously address gender-based violence. On human dignity, it was agreed that a working definition need to be developed to possibly include understanding human rights and listening to the voices of the beneficiaries, empowering affected communities by including consulting them and decision-making process, preserving the widest range of choices for those who are affected, and ensure respect of their personal information. And also to respect equality in providing assistance and protection and prevention from inhuman treatment. Also discussed and agreed that there's a need to advocate for existing rules and standards that regulated human dignity and ensure its implementation. There's also a need to mainstream human dignity aspects in developing legal frameworks, humanitarian standards and policies, and that it is important to also include in national and regional legal frameworks with respect for international humanitarian law and human rights, especially in conflict settings. To also respect diverse cultural identity and needs to ensure humanitarian action take into account the needs of the affected population, especially the vulnerable populations. To also adopt user-friendly monitoring, evaluation, and feedback mechanism to allow affected communities to express their voices, as well as to ensure the privacy and avoid any forms of discrimination. Lastly, do no harm principle should be applied. Thank you all for your attention and listening. Also discussed and agreed that there's a need to advocate for existing rules and standards that regulated human dignity and ensure its implementation.
Okay, excellent. And thank you, Pansy, for very helpfully recording that presentation in advance. We anticipated that there might be some connection difficulties today from Myanmar, and Pansy did a wonderful job in preparing this audio recording. So thanks again for that, Pansy. And I do hope that we will be able to bring you in live on the phone for the Q&A. Based on our test before the event, it seems that it should be possible. But thanks again for those excellent insights across several different dimensions of the consultation process in the region. So now we are going to be turning to Takeshi, who should be joining us live, and we'll be unmuting you, Takeshi, so you can come in live with your audio, and you can move the slides of the presentation using the right arrow, which is underneath the presentation on your screen. I'm just checking to see if you're live. Okay, we hear you loud and clear. The floor is yours. Okay.
Yes. Thank you very much. Hello all, my name is Takeshi. I've been also serving on the regional steering group for this regional consultation in Tokyo, mainly representing this NGO civil society side on behalf of the Asian Disaster Reduction and Response Network, which is the Asian NGO network. And I would particularly like to highlight the importance of pre-consultation to these regional events. Because without, having the really in-depth pre-consultation, you don't really get a meaningful dialogue in the 2 days of the event that you will get. And so I would say from our experience also, the pre-consultation is as important as participation to the actual event. So for our colleagues who have the upcoming regional events, we would like to recommend to put a lot of energy and time into that as well. And we would like to thank all the civil society members who took part in that survey, and particularly our colleagues from IFRC, International Council of Voluntary Agencies, ADRRN, ACT Alliance, and so on, and all the national networks. Thank you very much for that. So I'll be covering 2 of the WHS themes, as well as 2 cross. Now, one on the transformation through innovation. First of all, through the discussion in Tokyo, we found out that there are many examples that we already have that that is evident in the humanitarian sector nowadays. But a lot of them are based on the IT solutions. For example, the social networking services, the chat functions, the crowdsourcing. One example was this information sharing portal, which were displaying the needs of the affected communities, the aid types and quantity of the aid that was delivered, presence of different actors and their roles and responsibilities, as well as the volunteering opportunities, which is becoming more increasingly important in the middle-income countries and high-income countries. But then there are these examples, but there was also a concern that many of these initiatives are done in more of an ad hoc way, and it's not really a collective, systematic efforts that are seen widely in the humanitarian sector. So the suggestions came up that we need to identify these, we need to capture these, and we need to disseminate so that many people can benefit from this. And when we do so, we need to focus on the usability and adaptability in the field. And some also noted that the role of communication technology was there also to enhance the coordination mechanism. For example, our colleagues from Korea, they've utilized the chat system to let everyone know the key information discussed and decided during the cluster coordination meetings in the Philippines. As you all know, that not everyone can attend these meetings. So there was many good examples there. Now, different actors have different roles to enhance these innovative practices. For example, there's a role for the government to play in supporting humanitarian innovation, whether by financing innovation, disseminating transferable solutions across the emergencies, or facilitating the partnership with different actors like academia and the private sector at the national level. But there's also a big role for the local community-based organizations and communities to play. And people have expressed this in the form of a paradigm innovation that incorporates the local wisdom in the business that we conduct, as well as to build on the local ownership that's there. And the regional organizations has also a role to play in facilitating access to these innovation and tools to their member states and different actors in their member states. In terms of the key recommendation on this theme, they have summarized it very well. They say 3 Fs. These Fs stand for, first of all, forums, framework, and funding, as well as the partnership. So what does it mean? Basically, it's saying that the more investment is needed on this innovation. But basically, what investment? On the forums, people have expressed that there's a need to establish, for example, a CSO network at the local level. Of course, that's where the first responders are placed. And that is aimed to improve the partnership, as well as people have expressed that there needs to be sort of entrepreneurial fairs to showcase innovation for humanitarian action. And there was also ideas such as a humanitarian journal. So that was one of the practical recommendations on that, on the forums. On the framework, people have suggested to establish a regional level framework that addresses the principles and ethics of innovation. On the funding, there was just a suggestion to establish an innovation fund or make more investment into research and development in this area. Now, but not the new coordination mechanism is really needed. People said, they were more looking for example, engineering innovation through partnership with the World Economic Forum, these existing players that are already there, strengthen partnership with academia, research institution, private sector, youth groups, you name it. So basically, utilizing these existing networks and mechanisms, people have suggested to harness those to get to the level that where we want to be. That's for the transformation through innovation. Now, on the serving the needs of people in conflict, which is another key WHS theme, civil-military coordination. There was a wide recognition of the role of military and their role in the humanitarian aid sector. So we all know this is important, but challenging thing becomes when governments themselves are engaged in conflict. And people have suggested that there needs to be a regional guideline on civil-military coordination, especially in the conflict setting, because that does not exist in this region. And there's a need to enhance the mutual understanding between the humanitarians and armed forces with respect to each other's mandate and sensitivity and their roles in the humanitarian work. Because, as we all know, perception matters. Perception of the public also matters in the security sensitivity related issues. Now, again, different actors have different roles. For example, there was a mentioning that non-state actor. There was a recognition that discussion needs to be held with non-state actors to secure the humanitarian access. But there's a lack of clear guidance on how to interact with them. And this was problematic. And this also leads to the need for such a regional guideline, as I just explained as well. There was a recognition that the local CSOs also play a critical role, especially in securing access to affected population, and also in understanding what the affected communities really need. There were some cases that have been shared that humanitarian agencies were not really providing what the conflict-affected communities really needed. So, to understand that, we need to have the local players making an assessment and the coordination as well. And these local CSOs also play a key role in the local and national level advocacy. An interesting insight was for the business, and people have raised this point that the business could respond to the needs of people in conflict when it is difficult for the humanitarian agency to access. And I think we all have experienced that in one way or another in our work as well. It's interesting to focus that here. On the legal framework, there was a sort of a problem statement that the ratification of the additional protocols to the Geneva Convention, as well as on the status of refugees, was quite low in this region. And as a way forward, there was suggestion that there needs to be a regional convention to protect IDPs and migrants as well. And this migrants was also highlighted that because in the disasters that we've seen in the world, the assistance and protection for migrants doesn't really fit anywhere. And they can be left out in many cases. And people have emphasized also that international humanitarian law should be the guiding tool in this establishing a legal framework. Now, on conflict prevention, people have expressed that there's a need to develop this body of analysis for benefits of preventing the conflicts, because the existing regional institutions and networks could benefit from strengthening and expanding their work on the conflict prevention, mediation, and peace building. And these roles should be further strengthened. But again, as it was evident from the previous presentation, the rule of thumb is to bear in mind the negative consequences the humanitarian operation can produce. So adherence to do no harm principle is utmost importance here. Key recommendation to the theme is on the 4 points. And these 4 points are guidance, legal provision, strengthening institutional capacity, and interaction. Now, on guidance, as noted before, the region-specific guidelines on civil-military coordination in conflict setting should be developed. Building on international practice was one suggestion. The second one was related investments should be made in training and capacity building of both humanitarian and military actors to enable better mutual understanding of roles and responsibilities. On the legal provisions, there was a suggestion to develop the regional convention for the protection and assistance to internally displaced persons and migrants. And this should be proposed for inclusion in the Secretary General's report to the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016. On strengthening institutional capacity, existing regional institutions and networks for conflict prevention, mediation, and peace building should be strengthened, expanded, and adequately resourced. Lastly, on the interaction, they have suggested that humanitarian organizations should create occasions to interact with the military at the highest possible level. For example, exchange programs at the regional level should be organized and facilitated between the highest ranks of the military chain of command and the humanitarian organization to share experiences and good practices on how to promote and respect international humanitarian law. Okay, so those were the WHS themes. Now I'm going to cover two of the cross-cutting issues. One was on the complexity and the other on the legal frameworks, very quickly. On complexity, first of all, what does complex emergencies mean? Now, people have expressed that humanitarian emergency can become complicated by overlapping of, for example, man-made technical disasters, economic and political sanctions, secondary risk of industrial exploitation, and effects of corruption and weak governance. So basically, these different risks cascading its effect to others. One good example, as this consultation was held in Tokyo, there was a participant also from Fukushima indicating the 2011 disaster, which there was a 9.0 magnitude earthquake that triggered tsunami, as well as a nuclear disaster in Japan. So looking at these different risks interacting each other is also a trend in the region. There was also a problem statement that current cluster coordination systems are, of course, beneficial in many emergencies, but they sort of lack the flexibility in case of complex situations, as the mandate of humanitarian agencies involved do not fit. So that's another thing to think about. And there's a role of prevention and the risk reduction. Again, and of course, main responsibilities lie with the governments to protect their own citizens. But there was also a recognition that CSOs play a role in community preparedness, and building this community capacity further is needed. And there needs to be an international standard on working in complex situations, such as nuclear radiation or industrial exploitation. And different agencies, different mandates should be looked into in such complex emergencies. Now, lastly, on this, people have expressed that there needs to be attention to multi-hazard approach to humanitarian action and disaster management, as well as, of course, do no harm in mind. The other cross-cutting issues on the legal framework, this is the last one that I'm going to cover, is, now, first of all, what is the role of the legal frameworks? Now, main aim of these legal frameworks should be to support more accountable and effective humanitarian action. But people have expressed that there needs to be, there needs to have a DRR, disaster risk reduction, placed at the center of policy and addressing risks. And one good example that has been presented was the Asean Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response, which is also called ADMER. This is a legally binding regional framework in Southeast Asia region on disaster management, which is quite rare. In terms of issues and recommendations on this topic there was an issue that people have faced, that often in emergency situation, there was the process of entering the visas, the customs, the bureaucratic process. Now that needs to be facilitated faster. Now, there needs to also consider, when thinking about the national legal system, there needs to be an international agreement keep in mind, such as Geneva Convention, to be taking their elements into the national legislations. And there needs to be a proactive scenario setting to deal with possible issues. And one example that was shared was how to handle dead bodies. And the line of command on these issues should be clear before any emergencies. So I guess to wrap up for both cross-cutting themes, the key points really that has emerged from this consultation was to proactively map future risks and the risk scenarios and put systems and procedures in place to mitigate those impacts. Thank you very much, and back to the chair.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Takeshi, for your very helpful insights and explanation, getting a bit deeper into a number of the substantive issues that were addressed in Tokyo. Thanks again. So now we will be turning back to Oliver for a couple of additional cross-cutting issues that we want to make sure to address today in the presentations before we get into the open Q&A. And Oliver, we're unmuting you. And you should be unmute now.
Thank you, Anghada, very much. I hope you can hear me a bit clearer this time. I will look at two of the final two cross-cutting issues, which were on migration and something called inclusive coordination. On migration, I mean, I think that the real wake-up moment in Tokyo was to recognize that migrants have humanitarian needs, which often gets forgotten during crises because it's very difficult for migrants to connect to any particular humanitarian agency. And we need to bear this in mind and think about it, particularly in situations of conflict, but also in disasters. And I think there are sort of two or three recommendations that really sort of started to shine from this group. One was that governments and international, regional, and national actors need to give special attention to the development and human rights needs of migrants. And the second is that very simply, states should ratify international conventions and respect international principles of protection for people who are on the move. So a very sort of tight discussion there, and some very clear points coming out. Under inclusive coordination, this was a little bit more detailed and a sort of big topic with quite a lot of discussion. I'd suggest that people look at the full report, which is on pages 27 and 28. And really, I think, it goes back to the point that I made, and it was also discussed a little bit in one of the questions that was raised earlier during the webinar. Really, for governments to be right at the middle of coordination efforts. And government needs to be kind of the overall coordinator or the leader of coordination. And national structures should really be inclusive and allow everybody who's involved in action to be in the room and supported by adequate legal frameworks. So very much cross-cutting with some of the points that Takeshi should make. And a real kind of desire to drill down and talk about the work of municipal governments and what they do. Because when we say government, the focus always seems to instantly to be on capitals. And colleagues from China basically suggested, coordination works very well if you have a strong central government. And perhaps in that case you do. In other cases, it's perhaps not quite so central. And then, there were a number of other issues which very much kind of flowed from the discussion around legal frameworks. The need for strong disaster response laws, starting to look at, laws that regulate how various actors behave in conflict situations, also considered to be important. But a very clear distinction also between, the need to be in the room for certain organizations, entities, individuals to be in the room when decisions are made versus the need to share information. And this is also something that came up in the context of the transformative agenda, that making decisions doesn't require every single person who has an interest to be in the room. Decisions need to be made quickly and on the basis of life-saving criteria, but information does need to flow freely so that those who are involved in a coordinated humanitarian action understand what is going on, where the priorities lie, and how those can be addressed. There was a specific reference to the issue of coordination during in conflict situations, and really a desire to invest in government's understanding of the role that they should be playing during conflicts. And that should certainly include some kind of complaints mechanism and feedback mechanism to allow for better two-way communication between governments and people who are stuck in conflict. I mean, an extremely tall order and very difficult to implement, but certainly something that came through quite strongly at the consultation. So these are sort of the two final cross-cutting themes, and I hope I covered them adequately. As I say, please take a look at the report where they're far more articulately laid out. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks Oliver for that. And now I've asked my colleague Marcus to create a new presentation here so that we can see all of the results of the polls that have been running in the background for the last few minutes. It's been a really interesting response. So our team here in PHAP has been looking at results of the summit, the report of the summit, and we put together a few poll questions, and many of you have seen that have been answering. So before we get into the Q&A, I'd like to just take us on a quick tour of what the group here in the virtual room is thinking about right now in terms of some of these critical questions that came up and were discussed in Tokyo. So first, the question, what is the best way to strengthen and increase innovation? This was a topic that was addressed in one of the earlier presentations. And as we can see here in the results, the vast majority here are looking at a couple of main ways. So first, to explore new sources of innovation such as academia, research institutions, the private sector, and youth. So to expand the circle, look into areas beyond the traditional humanitarian sector. But a runner-up would be the establishment of a CSO network at the local level. So interesting results there, and I think I would absolutely encourage everyone to continue answering these poll questions if you haven't seen them. Second, we asked the question, stakeholders noted that businesses use more innovation solutions and technologies than humanitarians, and do you think that enhanced partnerships with the private sector would be beneficial to humanitarian action? Why or why not? And this is an open question. We're getting a number of results here which we'll include in the summary report of today's event, but it looks as if most people are saying yes, but. So yes, it's a good idea, but one should proceed with caution, or there are a number of considerations that need to be taken into account when looking at cooperation between the humanitarian sector and private. And I won't go through all of these questions because I don't want to take all of the time from the Q&A, but just to highlight that this seems to be a great way to get feedback of all of you here in the room, and I'd encourage all of you to continue to fill the questions and look at the responses of your colleagues as well as we're having the discussion for the next few minutes. So now, as you've all seen, we've had a very active discussion in the chat throughout these presentations today, and so now since I hope that our presenters have also had the opportunity while they weren't speaking to look in the chat and see some of the topics that were being discussed. Before we get into specific questions, I'll just do a quick round the room here with our panelists and ask if you have any initial reactions, or if there are any points that you saw coming up in the chat during other people's presentations that you would like to respond to or react to right away. And I think we can go to Oliver first, and I think you should be unmuted still, Oliver. Back to you.
Thank you. I have myself muted on my end, so I hope you can hear me now. I mean, I think there's a very interesting, I mean, both in the chat and in the questions that are coming up, there's some very interesting issues which are already drilling down. Sort of, I think that the level we got to in Tokyo is to look at some of the system issues, and as you've heard from the presentation, quite hopefully far-reaching recommendations coming out there. But what I'm seeing coming in from colleagues who are in the session today is very much looking immediately at issues like gender, child protection, and so on and so forth. And I think we need to find a way to capture. I mean, you know, my immediate reaction to some of these is I don't really have very coherent or clear answers arising from Tokyo. I have my own views, of course, but we don't have very clear answers arising from Tokyo. And I think, one of the outcomes that that we felt needed to happen after Tokyo is at some point before the end of this year, definitely kind of stop and think moment. What are the key emerging issues that we need to take forward in the sort of second round of consultations, and plant those questions into, some more directed questions, if you like, into the second round of consultations. And I think they emerged also from the stakeholder consultations we had in advance, but working out how to take the stakeholder consultation questions, the questions that are coming up from sessions like these, or the points coming up from sessions like these, and how we put those into the consultations that are up and coming, and also ask the thematic teams, of course, that are working under Jamila's guidance in New York, how all of these questions can be addressed, or to turn around at some point and say, look, we're not going to address these as part of the World Humanitarian Summit process because they're too numerous, but it's clear that processes need to be put into place. I see particularly the discussion between Karen and Jamila on child protection, and there's an interesting discussion there about whether or not we have adequate standards and so on and so forth in place. I tend to go with Jamila's view, which is about the legal frameworks, and the legal frameworks have been addressed in Tokyo, but much more from the perspective of how they enable coordination and how we address issues around abuse, violence, and so on and so forth, often perpetrated either by humanitarians themselves or by people who are working in humanitarian settings. So that, I guess, would be kind of my big initial takeaway from what I'm seeing in the discussions that are taking place online.
Great, thank you, Oliver. And now we'll be turning to Pansy. So we'll be testing to see if we can get your audio in here, Pansy, and if it doesn't work, then we'll go to Takeshi. So Pansy, you should be online if you could try speaking.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you well. If you can speak up a little bit louder, just a little bit louder, and then you're fine.
Okay. First of all, thank you all for allowing me to participate in this forum. We have a bit of a difficulty here, very disruptive line, and I was not able to hear much of the presentations, but the PowerPoints definitely help a bit. Here I'd like to also highlight the fact that this accountability issue is really very, very important. This accountability by all parties, all actors, and having to include accountability in national frameworks, that is really a priority, and accountability of donors, the CSO, and community members themselves. I think everybody needs to know what accountability is, and they should be able to practice it. And secondly, I'd like to also mention that really innovative ways need to be explored further as to how we can best work and effectively apply those innovative ways in humanitarian actions. And thirdly, I'd like to also mention that donors really need to review their policies and procedures in humanitarian funding, and also donors need to coordinate and collaborate more in response to humanitarian actions. So thank you all. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes, thank you, Pansy. That was, yes, that was
okay.
Great. Yeah.
Thank you. Great. Thank you.
So now we'll be turning to Takeshi. I hope, Takeshi, you were able to follow a bit the chat during the presentations, and it would be interesting to hear what were any of your initial reactions to what was being discussed there.
Sure. I'll just share a few, and I'm not really, how can I say, familiar with looking at all these, different boxes, like as if you're pilots. But anyways, on a few points, I think someone has mentioned that really the devil is in the detail. We talk about the things that we always talk about, and so what? And this is really I think the takeaways from these regional consultations and the process that leads to regional consultation is really for everyone to ask, so what are you going to do about it? it's not only a UN problem. It's not only a government or donors problem. It's not only a private sector problem. It's NGOs also need to step up in order to solve the existing problems that we see. So I guess this multi-stakeholder process has allowed also the civil society side to ask ourselves, what are we really going to do about it to change this? For example, in the coordination, we see these local CSO inclusion in the formal humanitarian coordination system, make it participatory. All that stuff is in the lesson learned of every evaluation, every time. So what are we going to do about it? So I guess those are the takeaways really from these regional consultations. So I agree absolutely to those comments that, the important thing here is not to just, put issues on the table, but really to discuss practically how are we going to solve these. There was also a question about how to work with the government in the conflict setting, because it becomes very sensitive. And of course, some may think that it contradicts to our aspiration that the governments need to take the leading driving seat in the humanitarian response. But when they are actively engaged in the conflict setting, it becomes difficult to do so. And from CSO side, we may be a bit biased, but this is where we thought that the role of local communities and the local CSOs come into play, because they are the one who understand the sensitivity. They are the one who understand who to talk to in the local government, who to talk to the regional government and the central government, how to make sure that these humanitarian needs can be addressed. So putting these people in the driving seat, and when we say driving seat, it's really about in the decision-making table, and that's not happening at the moment. And we need to do something about it in order to put these local voices at the center of the discussion table and also the center of the decision-making table. I will stop there, and I'll be happy to take any more questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So now picking up on one of the points that Takeshi was raising from the chat, so regarding who's in the driver's seat and the engagement with or the role of governments in relation to humanitarian action, there was a specific question coming in through the Q&A box from one of our participants, Miwa Hirono, and I'll just read the question, and this I think should be directed really to all three panelists. But since Takeshi was just addressing it, we'll go first back to Pansy and then to Oliver for the response. So Miwa writes, I like the point that host governments should be in the driver's seat, which particularly suits the East Asian culture, tradition, and history as well. However, I could imagine some might think, and rightly so, that governments are self-interested actors, particularly when governments are involved in conflicts. Humanitarian assistance should be driven by what is called the international community. Should we be talking about, or to what extent or in what way, should governments who engage in conflict remain in the driving seat? So the question about who should be in the driving seat, when, where, how, and in what context, particularly in a conflict setting. So if I may ask my colleague to unmute Pansy. Okay, Pansy, I think you're all set to go if you're still on the line. Okay, so it seems we have a problem with Pansy's connection, so we'll go to Oliver, if I may.
Thank you very much. I think this was discussed at some length during the consultation in Tokyo. I mean, the conflict session was perhaps the one that we were, if I'm honest, it was the one that we were most nervous about before the consultation, and I think the one that we've been most nervous about through this whole World Humanitarian Summit process. But I think what was interesting in Tokyo was that people did not shy away from discussing some of the issues that we're facing in providing humanitarian assistance. This key role, the role that governments play, and really, this is where we get down into some of the nitty-gritty around the adherence to an application of humanitarian principles by non-governmental actors, by so-called humanitarian organizations, and making sure that we are demonstrating our commitment to humanitarian principles so that we can get assistance to people who are in need, And if that means, talking to governments who are involved in conflict, and it means talking to other parties to conflict, then we of course need to do that. I don't think that we reached any very clear conclusion in Tokyo about this, other than what I mentioned earlier, which came up in this inclusive coordination element. And I think really the conversation there was very much around recognizing that, you can't say to a government, well, you can't be involved because you're a party to the conflict. That simply doesn't work. So it's a matter of really sitting down with state authorities and explaining to them what their role needs to be in terms of permitting and allowing humanitarian access. And we've seen some examples of where this has been extremely difficult here in this region, I think precisely for the reasons that the questioner has put on the table. So I think there was no really clear answer to this coming out of the Tokyo consultation. But since we have a whole theme that is looking at serving the needs of people in conflict, my hope is that in subsequent discussions, in subsequent consultations, that there will be a bit more clarity.
Your microphone has been turned on.
Hello?
Sorry, Oliver, I think you were fading a bit there, but you're back now. Was that the end of your response?
Yes, I don't know if I got cut off before the end. But I mean, the final point I would make is that it will be good if colleagues can look at the related page on the final report, which provides 4 areas of recommendations. One relates to this whole issue of civil military coordination. And secondly, and perhaps most importantly to this, is the development of legal provisions. And this is the idea of looking at the possibility of regional conventions for the protection of and assistance to IDPs and migrants. And that sort of drills down below what we have right now, which are global conventions. And the feeling that it might be easier to look at putting rules of engagement into place at regional level than it is at the global level around the role of governments in conflict.
Okay, great. Thank you, Oliver. We did catch it then. And I believe now we do have Pansy, so we'll try going back to you,
Your microphone has been turned on.
Yeah, hello, yeah, I am back on. The phone got cut off. Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
We hear you. If you can speak more loudly, that would be better, but we do hear you.
Okay. Okay. I feel that the governments really, have the role to play in the conflict. And in any conflicts, I think government, if they are not going to take the driver's seat, should allow at least humanitarian actors to have access and provide the necessary assistance. Because oftentimes the affected population, they are left with little or no assistance, and it's very difficult. They don't know who to turn to, the government, and the armed conflict, especially that we are facing here in Kitchen. The IDPs have been suffering there with no assistance from anyone. And what we have been doing here is to have the CSOs and the communities and the private actors to go into these affected areas and providing relief goods. And the government does not encourage that, but these people have to provide these services without, the support of the government nor the donors. No donors are going in there for the time being. And so I think it is very important for the community and the CSOs to really encourage and convince the humanitarian actors to work with respective governments to ensure that humanitarian assistance reach these affected areas so that the people will not, suffer that much. There are also other problems such as the IDPs and migrants and trafficking. Those are kind of the consequences of all these conflicts. So I would like governments to be more supportive of providing assistance to this affected population, and donors should also try to look at these issues again and see, even if the government is not supportive, how can they best work to help this population. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pansy. And we have
We
several more questions coming in for you, but before we come back to those, I'm going to turn to Takeshi to see if you have any further comments more specifically related to this question from Miro regarding the role of governments, particularly in conflict situations. So Takeshi, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I would probably just echo what colleagues have said already about the role of the communities and also local CSOs. And you know, we talk about inclusion of these people many times, and also I believe there was also a question about how do you ensure that with such a new players and many players, how do you ensure a humanitarian standard to be in place, etc. With so many issues that we discuss in Tokyo, for us, it kind of boils down to really one word, which is preparedness, the role of preparedness. I think we need to invest more in preparedness. For example, you know, if the optimal level of local CSO participation is not there, or the optimal resources for the local CSOs to respond to those needs of people in a conflict is not there, then there needs to be a prior agreement. There needs to be a prior mapping out of the actors and probably signing of the MOUs. And when something happens, then you are included, then you coordinate, and you know the roles and responsibility becomes clear. And all that things, we try to do that at the onset of emergencies. And we kind of know what are the countries that would, you know, experience the emergency, which is difficult to handle with only the national capacity. So I guess we need to step up in this preparedness activities even more and more. I guess that needs to be also a commitment from CSO side as well. Over to you.
Excellent, thank you. Now we have a couple of other questions that I'd like to address to the whole panel. So first we have a question coming in from Alexina Mugwebi-Rusere, who's asking, inadequate resources critically affect service delivery of humanitarian assistance. How can this situation be improved? So I'm sure that this must have been discussed to some extent at the consultation in Tokyo, but from each of your perspectives, how might the persistent challenges regarding fundraising and raising adequate resources for humanitarian response, how might that situation be improved? Were there any new ideas that you heard coming up, or new ways of looking at the challenge raised in Tokyo? And then as another question coming in, we had a point raised in the chat somewhat early on in the discussion, the presentations today, and then several people were asking related questions on the topic of accountability. So Subhatra Jayara pointing out that the channeling of funds directly to local organizations and service providers is absolutely important, but that it must be with proper accountability mechanisms in place, and wondering whether this question of accountability mechanisms in the context of increased channeling of funds directly to local organizations, whether that was addressed in the consultation. And then also on the theme of accountability, but from a somewhat different angle, a question from Tabo regarding what about accountability to ensure that disadvantaged members of society have the opportunity to express themselves if they feel that assistance has not been well implemented. So what's often referred to as beneficiary accountability, was accountability in that direction raised. And I believe that the issue of accountability did did come up to some extent through our presentations today, but wondering if each of our panelists could boil that down to what they had as the main takeaways on that subject of accountability from both of these perspectives from Tokyo. So just to sum up, then we had the first question to all panelists on the issue of resources and ways in which resources available to humanitarian assistance can be increased or improved, and then the second regarding accountability in multiple directions to multiple stakeholders. So for this, I'll first turn to Oliver, and then we'll go to Pansy, and then back to Takeshi. So I'll ask that Oliver be unmuted in 1 moment.
Am I on?
Now you're on, Oliver. You sound good.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. I'll be brief. A couple of points. I mean, I think on the issue of money, absolutely right. The clear message that we're getting and that was fed into the discussion in Tokyo is that from our traditional donor community, which is a very small grouping of northern and western countries, don't expect huge increases in funding. The money simply isn't there when they're looking at their own domestic issues, and of course humanitarian assistance to other countries is becoming an increasingly contentious domestic issue in some of these countries, which means that we have to go elsewhere. And it means that we have to adapt and change the way in which the current humanitarian system is structured, the way it works, who it considers itself to be accountable to. And that's going to be a painful process because I think we've become very used to the way things work right now, the mechanisms that have been put into place. And I would say also that that small group of northern western donors have become very comfortable with what they have created, and they want people coming in and rocking the boat. But I think, this is one of the reasons why the Secretary General called the summit. He recognized that there's a whole bunch of stuff going on outside of this sort of traditional humanitarian system that we need to understand, work with, seek resources from, and adapt to. And that's what this process, this World Humanitarian Summit process, for me at least, is very much about. It's about changing the way that we do business in recognition that needs are changing and in recognition of the fact that the world has changed very much since the current system was put into place in 1991. And I think the recommendations coming out of Tokyo are relatively clear on this. The reporting recommendations and the funding and accountability recommendations are relatively clear, perhaps not far-reaching enough, but we still had 18 months to go before we get to the final crunch discussion in Istanbul, and certainly some issues were put on the table around those two issues. So enough from me on that. On the issue of accountability, I find myself a little irritated with the nature of the questions, if I'm honest, because we take a position that we have to hold others accountable, whereas I think we need to be collectively accountable for our actions. We divide ourselves up into the UN, international NGOs, national NGOs, civil society organizations at subnational level, and each of those groupings have a particular pecking order, a particular place, and I think we need to break this down a little bit and look at, how we perceive each other. The UN contracts international NGOs contracts national NGOs, and so we have this flow of resources through multiple levels, and as you go down through this whole process, the financing that's provided to support things like accountability becomes thinner and thinner and thinner, and the higher up the feeding chain you go, the louder the discussions become about what should be done further down the chain. And for me, this is very troubling. And I think it's something that we really need to tackle and address. So I think there's a much bigger piece around how we are framing accountability than what accountability actually is or what it should be. And I don't think we're framing it right. And I think that to a certain extent, Tokyo saw and understood that, which was why there was this very marked series of points about supporting and working with civil society organizations. That doesn't just mean giving them more money. It also means helping them to do the sort of accountability to put into place the sort of accountability framework that they need to have into place to do their job, not for us, but for the people that they are working with. And it also behooves, I think, those of us who are more distant, and one of the sets of comments about this, those of us who are more distant need to actually get closer to where the action is. How we do that and how we break out of the current quite hierarchical system that we have, I don't know. But I would like that to be put on the table in Istanbul. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Oliver. Very helpful comments, I think, particularly on the framing of accountability, which has been a major point of discussion, and I think very, very helpful with your input on that. Now, we are running rather short on time, so we have many questions we haven't been able to address, but I'm going to turn to Pansy and ask if you have comments on any one or more of these three, so the issue of the funding, the issue of accountability, or we have an additional question coming in for you from Subhatra regarding specifically gender in emergencies and how we can integrate the resources required for gender in emergencies into the overall efforts required, mainly so that this is not perceived as a competition with other sectors. So maybe a different spin or additional detail on the resources question. So Pansy, to you, and then if you would also...
Your microphone has been turned on.
Some very brief closing remarks. And then move to Takeshi. And we should have Pansy online now.
Yeah, can you
Your
hear me
microphone
now?
has been turned
I
on.
can hear you now. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. What I like to emphasize here is that the government also have a role to play in putting appropriate legislation on having certain kind of humanitarian funding for the country. Each national government, that is the number one thing that they should do. Secondly, I think we can also, like what we had discussed in Tokyo, that we can also capitalize on the private sector approaches and try to get certain like percentage of maybe taxation or something to be set aside for humanitarian purposes. Secondly, very quickly on accountability issue, I think just like what Oliver had said, everybody is accountable. We should have the mechanisms in place, and we should ensure that accountability should be the humanitarian principle that is applied, should be applied for all actors, including the donors, and also the community and the CSOs who are receiving receiving humanitarian funding are accountable. And thirdly, on gender in emergency, it should not be in silos. It should be part of the national legislation, and it should be mainstream in all other programs. And especially in emergencies, there should be certain kind of legislation by the government to also ensure that gender issues are addressed in any kind of emergency or disasters. And it would be ideal if certain kind of gender budgeting can also be included in this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Pansy.
Thank you, Pansy.
Finally, we'll turn to Takeshi for your comments on these two general questions, the funding, the accountability, and then Takeshi, if you have any final remarks, you're very welcome to offer those.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be quick. I know the time is running out. On the resource issue, I echo what Oliver has said. You know, it's really about the partnership with different sectors. And in order to do that, though, you know, we need to change our mindset also. Sometimes we humanitarians have this mindset that this is our industry. And if someone else is going to come in, they have to abide by these rules that we have drafted. But in many cases nowadays, we see different scenarios everywhere. The resources that we channel is a lot less than what they get from the local sort of network of communities and also diaspora communities outside their countries. And so the landscape is changing. So that mindset, I guess, is another point that I would add to the resource question. On the accountability, again, I would emphasize that the voices that are closer to the field should be brought in to the center of the discussion and center of decision making, and that really emphasized the role of the local civil society in these coordination mechanisms, in these discussion forums, and the role that the preparedness also plays. That these actors need to be mapped out, their TORs need to be drafted, and they have to be included, and they have to be trained maybe in some way. But I guess that's really the key. If we don't have those mechanisms preset, then we shouldn't really dream of having that mechanism in place when L3 emergencies happen. It's just impossible. So that's for the accountability. And for the closing remark from myself, really, I would emphasize again that I guess the key thing for us involved in this process of World Humanitarian Summit is really to ask each of ourselves that what are we going to do about it? And I think if we really put our brains into it like that, we will be able to come up with solutions, the innovative ones that addresses the existing issues that we see, and we'll be able to solve those issues that we see in the recommendation or the evaluation reports all the time. So I guess it's a collective effort, and thank you very much for all your participation today. Over.
Fantastic. Thanks, Takeshi. And I hope that everyone will forgive me. We're going a little bit over time, but the discussion is still so active. We want to make sure to finish. So I'm going to give the floor to Oliver for his own concluding remarks before we end the event. Before I do, I want to point out that we have put up all of the poll questions. So please do, if you haven't yet, take an opportunity to put in your 2 cents in that format as well, with all of these questions. And again, the responses will be included in the report of this event, which, as you can see, will have a lot of rich content to it. So we'll go back to Oliver now, and you should be unmuted, Oliver. You're ready to go for closing remarks.
Great, thank you so much. This is, another amazing 90 minutes, and thank you so much for facilitating this to PHAP. It's been really good. I guess sort of, my concluding thoughts are, what a rich discussion we've had here today. It's a shame we couldn't go on for another hour and have a bit more interaction, but there we are. That's just the way things go. But I think this is what we need to keep moving on. We need to make sure that these discussions don't die because we produced a nice color report, which is now up on the website. There are some very important issues that got raised in Tokyo that need to be taken forward. They can be taken forward, I think, by the co-hosts of these various regional consultations. But for me, there are a couple of things that we haven't yet got right for the World Humanitarian Summit. One is coherence amongst all of our organizations. This is a global event that's moving slowly around the world over the next 18 months. And it's really important that we all have a sense of ownership. And what I was glad to see here was people starting to sort of, there's a definite sense coming from the dialogue here that people are starting to say, yeah, actually, maybe I can do something here. Maybe my organization can do something here. But that's not going to happen if we all go offline at the end of this event today and say, right, well, I asked my 2 questions and that was very useful. This is about coherence going forward, about coming up with clear positions that can be taken into the 2016 process. We have Jamila and her team in New York who are trying to manage a lot of things. They need help, and they need help from people who have humanitarianism at the heart of the work that they do. If we want to make changes to this system and we want to make it better, and it's clear there are a lot of things that need to be fixed, then we need to work on that collectively. It's not just the World Humanitarian Summit Secretariat and OCHA who need to be working on this. We need everyone to be engaged, and we need everyone to be involved beyond webinars and beyond the regional consultation. So please, think in your organizations and convey to your organizations the needs for proactive and corporate engagement in the World Humanitarian Summit process going forward. That is my plea. I think we're onto a good thing. I think the Tokyo meeting threw up a lot of issues that are going to need to be addressed. We have 18 months to do that, and we need to go into the Istanbul summit with some very clear recommendations on the way forward, and we need not to be afraid of change. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. It's always a pleasure to have you in these events, and with a call to action for everyone who's participating today. Very much appreciated from our end, and I would also underline really the importance for everyone and their organizations, as Oliver was saying, to commit time and attention and resources to ensuring that this opportunity is really taken to its full potential. So with that, and apologies again from my end for being a bit over time, thank you to everyone for their contributions today. Please do continue to be involved. Read more about upcoming summit events that PHAP will be hosting in cooperation with the Summit Secretariat at phap.org/consultations. And I'll also note, as Marcus has just written in the chat, that a recording and a report of today's event, incorporating what was in the chat, the Q&A, the information about who was participating, from what parts of the world, and of course the presentations and audio discussion will be made available on our website. Again, the URL is phap.org/consultations. And with that, warm thank you and goodbye from us here in Geneva. We encourage you to read more about the summit process overall and join the online consultations at www.worldhumanitariansummit.org, and of course to discuss on Twitter with #ReshapeAid. And you can read more about us as the hosts here at the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection, PHAP for short, at www.phap.org. And finally, you can follow all of the consultations that PHAP is hosting together with the summit on Twitter at PHAP Forum. So once again, signing off here from a surprisingly cold summer day in Geneva with the PHAP team. A pleasure speaking with all of you, and goodbye for now.